Welcome back to the History Fix, and this is going to be a different sort of History Fix from the usual, and we're going to do this occasionally. We're going to try and take a historical perspective on contemporary events, and as I speak there is an urban uprising spreading across the United States of America. We're into the third day of that now, in response to the racist murder of a Black American by killer cops in Minneapolis, and it seems to have triggered a massive urban insurrection now spreading across the United States. Now, urban insurrections, urban uprisings, they have a trigger, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the trigger, but they tend to have multiple causes as well. So I'm going to try and get to grips with those multiple causes and try and give us a bit more perspective on the events which are now unfolding. But let's start with that trigger. Let's start with the police, racism and violence, which of course is not just in relation to George Floyd, who's just been murdered and whose murder was filmed, and then of course the film went viral. This is a routine event in the United States where cops murder Black Americans, usually youngish Black men. Very often they do it in broad daylight, sometimes they're filmed doing it, and very often they just get away with it. This has become a routine part of the way in which modern policing works in the United States, and it's this that has triggered the current uprising. Now, racial oppression and racist violence runs like a thread through the whole of American history. You can trace it right back to the time of the Revolution in the late 18th century and before the Revolution, when white Americans freed themselves from British colonial rule, but because many of the leaders of the American Revolution were themselves slave owners, it turned out that freedom was to be restricted to white Americans, and it didn't apply to the very large numbers of Black Americans who were already there on the North American continent working as slaves. It wasn't until the time of the American Civil War, almost a century later, the greatest war, by the way, in American history. 2/3 of a million Americans died in the 4 years of the American Civil War, more than in all of the other American wars put together. And that was a great war to decide whether or not freedom was going to be restricted only to white folks or was going to include Black folks as well. Worth saying, by the way, that in that conflict, something like 200,000 former Black slaves donned American Union blue in order to fight for the emancipation of their Black brothers and sisters still being held as slaves in the southern states. Now, maybe that was a moment when there might have been a more general racial emancipation, but actually following the Civil War, the leaders of the North, the victorious North, pulled back and allowed the southern planter aristocracy to re-establish their power, to shore up racism. It wasn't slavery, but it was very often close to slavery. We talk about this period between the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century and the Civil Rights Movement in the middle of the 20th century. We talk about it as the period of the Jim Crow laws in the South. It meant systematic discrimination. It meant systematic segregation. It meant Black people being held down in sharecropping tenancies that were often close to slavery. It meant Black people being held down in the lowest of low-paid jobs, often having no jobs at all. It meant Black people being prevented from participating in the electoral process and so on. And this whole system of institutionalized racism enforced by the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist, racist, fascist, white supremacist organization, very often backed by the local police. Indeed, very often the local police would be leading Klansmen. So the black population held down in fear. Now, the next big shift in this sort of summary history of the black experience in America comes with the civil rights movement, of course, which begins in the southern states and is challenging the discrimination and the segregation of the Jim Crow system, eventually breaking it and spreading a wave of radicalization into the North, affecting the black working class in the North and affecting whole sections of the white working class as well. The civil rights movement feeds into that whole period of mass radicalization and mass struggle in the late 60s and the early 70s. And those are major advances which are won by that struggle. But, the big but, is that that very wave of struggle, which wasn't, of course, restricted to the United States, it was general across much of the world in the late 60s and the early 70s. And in a more general sense, the build-up of strong trade union organization, the development of the welfare state, an element of redistribution of wealth from the rich and the corporations to ordinary working people, a kind of social democratic consensus within the political system that was the right thing to happen. It provoked on the part of the ruling class, on the part of capital, on the part of the corporations and the rich, a counter-reaction, a counter-revolution. We've come to call that neoliberalism, and neoliberalism which is really forming in the 1970s and then unleashing its counterattack in the 1980s. We can define it really as an attempt to reverse that process, whereby there had been a relative redistribution of wealth, where living standards for working people had tended to rise, where there had been a challenge to racial oppression and women's oppression, where strong public services had been invested in by the state. There were reforms in housing, there was more funding for healthcare and education and so on. That whole period in the immediate, the 2 or 3 decades after the Second World War, provokes this massive counter-offensive where the attempt really is to drive down wages, to break union organization, to break social movements, to make people more insecure in their jobs, to make it easier thereby to shift the balance of wealth and power from working people, from the great majority, in favor of the rich. And we've seen the consequences of that as neoliberalism has unfolded over the last 40 years, not just of US history, not just of European history, but of world history. A massive shift of wealth on a global scale from working people and the poor to the people at the very top, with now grotesque levels of greed and concentration of wealth and inequality in society, and relative poverty, impoverishment, unemployment, insecurity, inadequate public services, and so on at the base. Now, that is in a sense, that's the social route for the eruption of urban protests, the urban uprising that is spreading across the United States. It's not just about racism, it's also being fed by this poverty and this inequality which has built up over 40 years of neoliberalism. In a sense, the lid has been blown off the cauldron in the United States. Now, I want to say something very specific about the way in which those two things, the racism and the violence of the police on the one hand, and the poverty, the inequality under neoliberalism are linked together. Because in the immediate post-war period in the 50s and the 60s, I think it's true to say there was a high degree of political consensus, mainstream consensus, around the idea that there should be a relative redistribution of wealth, around the idea there should be investment in public services, around the idea that everybody should have the benefits of a rising standard of living, and so on. When that changes, and it changes quite sharply, quite dramatically in the 1980s, the social democratic consensus, in other words, consent to the political system, begins to break down. And as you get an increasing level of anger and resentment about the injustices in society, the growing inequalities, the siphoning of wealth to the top, the decay of public services, and so on, as that builds up, the neoliberal elite, the neoliberal ruling class, is really doing two things. On the one hand, they're rolling out nationalism and racism and scapegoat politics as a way of dividing working people, so that working people don't unite together to take on the system, to take on the people who are really responsible for what is going on. On the other hand, where people do fight back, where there is dissent, where there is resistance, you need to crack down on it. So you get heavy-handed policing, you get a militarization of policing, you get police racism, you get the kind of thing that is represented by the murder just now, a few days ago, of George Floyd. These two things are connected together. The poverty and the racism and the repression are all part of a kind of neoliberal package, and the whole thing has suddenly exploded across the United States. Now, here's the last thing I want to say about this on the History Fix today, because we are, of course, as well as this urban uprising spreading across the United States, we are in the midst of this global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. That seems to be embedded now in the world economy. It's there as a kind of threat everywhere to working people. And of course, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to get the disease. But not just that, because the whole pandemic has been so mismanaged, particularly in the United States and in Britain, as a result of the negligence and the incompetence and the callousness of the neoliberal elite in both countries. They have been forced to introduce, and rightly so, having messed up the managing of the pandemic when it started, massive levels of lockdown become necessary in order to control the spread of the epidemic. But the consequence of that, of course, is that there is going to be enormous economic damage. Neoliberalism, in any case, is built on foundations of sand in economic terms. It's based on debt. It's based on financial speculation. It's based on the privatization of public services. It's based on ramping up prices and rents and so on. It's built on foundations of sand. It's an economy of boom, bubble and bust, as we have seen in 2008. But now it's facing a catastrophic economic and social collapse as a result of the impact of COVID-19. In the United States, right now, as I speak, there are about 40 million people unemployed. That's 1 in 4 Americans. That's at the same level as it was in 1932, early on in the Great Depression. There are queues to sign on in the poor areas of the United States that last all day. There are queues of cars trying to get into food banks that last all day. There is a massive social crisis now unfolding as a result of COVID-19, as a result of the underlying weaknesses of the neoliberal economy, and as a result of the incompetence and the negligence and the failure of our political elites. So that what is already bad for millions, tens of millions, and across the world, hundreds of millions of ordinary working people is set to get much, much worse in the period immediately ahead. There's a sense in which Minneapolis and the uprising, which is now spreading across the United States, the generalizing across the United States, represents a revolt from below of the oppressed, of the exploited, of the urban poor, and a protest which is wholly justified by the experience of the last 40 years, not just the racist behavior of the police a few days ago, and we're likely to see much more of that kind of mass resistance, and indeed we have to hope that we do see much more of that kind of mass resistance from below, so that our rulers, as we emerge from the immediate crisis of the pandemic, but then find ourselves confronted with a global economic and social collapse, so that our rulers are not enabled to make us, the great majority, ordinary working people, black and white, women and men, gay and straight and so on, again pay the price for their system and their crisis. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.